Hello, if you're here for content and context, artificial intelligence impact on technical writing and localization, you're in the right place. Let's jump on the screen really quickly here and say hello. My name is Scott Abel, and with me is my co-host, Patrick Bosek. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Scott. It's great to be here and very excited to have Allison Furch here with us. Nice to meet you, Allison.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
All right, before we get started, I'm going to tell the audience a few things about our platform while folks are logging in, and then we'll come back and we'll start the discussion. So just a few things that you should know about our webinar platform today. We don't have access to your camera or your microphone, so if you're new to the platform, just know that we can't see or hear you during today's broadcast. We are recording this show as a convenience for you, so that at the end of the show, about 30 minutes later, URL that you're using to watch today's live show will allow you to access an on-demand recording. You can also share that link with others that you think might be interested in the subject matter of today's show, and we hope that you'll do so. Also, we'd love for you to ask questions at any time. This is a talk show style show where we'll be interviewing a guest, and we'd love to hear from you. And you can ask a question anytime just by scrolling down beneath your webinar viewing panel to the Ask a Questions area, completing the little forms, send in the questions. Patrick and I will queue up those questions and try to get answers to as many as we can with the time that we have available on today's show. Also, there's some additional content in the attachments section, also located just beneath your webinar viewing panel. If you scroll down during the show at any time, you'll be able to access additional links to content, including some information from our sponsors, some upcoming conferences, and you can also click right through to the LinkedIn profile of our guest and the association that she works for so that you can understand a little bit more or reach out to her after the show. We'll also ask you to take a poll. There's one poll today. It's super easy to take. One question, 5 multiple choice answers. You pick the answer that's most appropriate for you. I'm opening the poll now, and the poll question is, which area best reflects where your documentation team most needs stronger with localization today? And your answer choices are these. We need earlier collaboration during content planning, or we need clearer terminology and style guidance, or we need better structure for machine readiness, AI, machine translation, automation, that kind of thing. Or we need more efficient review and feedback workflows. Or we're already collaborating well, but we just want to learn to scale and do it a little better. If any of those choices resonate with you, click those buttons for us. Let us know what you're thinking so that we'll have a better idea of where you stand on your documentation needs today to align with the localization team. At the end of the show, Patrick will ask you to give us a rating, which is just a rating on the quality of the information that you received today using our 1 through 5 star rating system, where 1 is a low rating and 5 is an exceptional one. There's also a little field into which you can type some feedback. We read it all. We want to hear from you, whether it's to help us make the shows better or to make a comment about the presenter. And we share the information that's relevant with the presenter after the show as well. A few upcoming announcements. We are super happy to be participating in the Center for Information Development Management's annual event, DITA Europe, this year in Brussels, Belgium, February the 2nd and 3rd at the La Plaza Hotel. If you're interested in the Darwin information typing architecture or utilizing XML and modular structured content to produce better capabilities in your technical documentation team, this is a great conference for you. You can click through to the link to the conference, which is just beneath your webinar viewing panel. If you scroll down a little bit and see the program availability, and you can save 10% off the cost of registration should you choose to go by using discount code TCW at checkout. Again, that information is available with a link just beneath your webinar viewing panel. And later in the year, April the 13th through the 15th in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, we'll be convening at Convex 2026, the Center for Information Development Management's annual event. It attracts 300 to 400 technical communicators and other professionals that are related to the discipline to talk about best practices, share case studies and lessons learned. There's a great exhibition area where you can check out the offerings from software and services vendors. And there are networking opportunities and workshops that are useful to folks in the technical documentation and information development industries. You can also save 10% when you use our discount code. Again, that link is just beneath your webinar view panel. Clicking it will not lose your place in the show. You'll just open a new browser tab so you can access that content whenever you like. I just want to encourage you also, if you're not a subscriber to the Content Wrangler blog, there's a link in the attachment section that'll take you right to the where you can do so, where you can keep up with what we're talking about in technical documentation and especially in artificial intelligence. If that's something that you'd like to do, go over and check it out. There's a link in the attachment sections below. And one final thank you to the webinar channel sponsor, Heredo, an all-in-one content operations stack for technical documentation teams. You can learn more about Heredo's offering on the web at heredo.com. And we're also going to hear from one of their customers from Medallia right now.
I've been in the software industry 35 years, and one of the things I love about Medallia is we make companies better. At Medallia Product Documentation Team, we have a goal, and our goal is that our documentation is the first and last place that people go to find information about our product. Product documentation is the official source of truth about what is supposed to be in the product. It has to be accurate, it has to be up to date, and it has to be accessible. Documentation, as I see it, is proactive, whereas support and knowledge centers are more reactive. Having good product documentation is key to supporting the product and to eliminating downstream costs. When a customer can self-service their own answer, it's a win for everybody. The customer gets the answer quicker, you reduce costs of support, and everybody's happy in the end.
All right. With that out of the way, let's start the interview today. I'll let Patrick kick this off, and we'll talk a little bit with Allison.
Thanks, Scott. All right. So before we actually jump into the content of today's show, I think our audience would love to know a little bit more about you, a little more about your background as the Globalization and Localization Association Executive Director. That's a long title. Also abbreviated GALA. So yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. So yeah, we call it GALA as much as possible and avoid that really long name. But I'm the executive director. GALA is the professional organization for folks in like any type of localization role. So it's a really diverse group of members. We have folks from enterprise side. We have folks from the vendor or language service provider side. We have people from universities. We have consultants and different verticals. They work in different media. They have different roles and tasks. And so as an association, our job is to support them to be better at their jobs. We do that through a lot of professional development, training, events, networking, things that an association typically does.
Do you have an annual conference as well?
We do. We have an annual conference. We move it around the world. Next year, it's in Berlin. It's April 12th through 14th. So anybody who's really interested in taking a deep dive on localization should come. We have a lot of fun. People are cool.
Yeah, it is cool. It is a cool show. There's good people. It's good learning. It's also lots of fun, which I think is important in today's world. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about what we've learned about the audience so far. Audience members, if you've just joined us, we have a poll open. You can take it if you still like it. It's still open, just beneath the webinar viewing panel. The question was, which area best reflects where your documentation team most needs stronger alignment with the localization teams? And it turns out that 52% of our audience so far say better structure for machine readiness. No big surprise there, which would be readiness for AI, machine translation and automation. 20% of them say they need clearer terminology and style guidance. 17% say more efficient review and feedback workflows. Then there's 5% say earlier collaboration during content planning. Those are the people who are with the program here today for sure. And 2% say they already collaborate well, but they would like to be able to scale that even further. So we've got some diverse audience members here today. So I guess my first question to you would be, Allison, what do you see as the biggest misunderstanding that maybe technical writers might have about globalization and localization, and then vice versa?
Okay, so it's not just technical writers that have this misunderstanding, but there's this notion that localization happens at the very end of the process, right before you ship. And that's not right. And in fact, that causes a lot of problems. So I would say that's a really common misconception. The vice versa part, probably something like, localizers judging the many by, the acts of a few. And so there's legends, of course, where somebody gets some kind of obscure file type, maybe some complex, schematic drawing, and then they're meant to put everything, it's all labeled, and they're meant to put everything in German. And so I think the misconception there is that all or very few technical writers don't think about localization don't think about global first. And we know that's not true, but like I said, it's a generalization.
Yeah, I think those myths creep in because those stories are kind of good and they are ridiculous sometimes. I mean, I've heard some of them, and they're good fodder for storytelling.
For sure. And a story moves a lot faster than the truth in most circumstances. So I can see how that can pop up. So from your perspective, like, what opportunities do they miss for this collaboration? Like, how can they be better? How can they avoid some of these problems?
I mean, I think that's a longer conversation. We'll probably get into more of it too, but just in general, like some folks said, terminology and style guidance for sure. I think identifying risks earlier in the process, like risks with the source content that would eventually lead to problems. Anything from like, ambiguity or unclear context or lack of sufficient context for translation, especially machine translation. I think we'll probably talk more, but it's like you said, just getting the input and kind of the collaboration from people who are thinking about language first.
That makes a lot of sense. And I don't think a lot of technical writers always are up to date and educated about all that's involved in localizing content, and nor do they always know how those decisions are made and what they decide to do, how it impacts people downstream. So how do you think AI changes the daily work for localization teams, and what should content creators like tech writers understand about those changes?
I mean, it's an evolving area, obviously. Like AI is changing daily work daily or weekly or monthly. And we get a long chat about that. But I would say that in general, we're kind of in this like post-hype recalibration where everybody's figuring out what their role is. I think content creators need to understand that the humans are no longer doing the translating and even the post-editing the way they used to, but they're like doing this complex orchestration of workflows. They're creating like architecture for the process that used to be done exclusively by a human. So now it's like a hybrid orchestration with AI. I think they should also understand that like data quality matters more than it ever did. So, spending time earlier in the process on glossaries, on style guidance, on training data, I think it's going to be super important. And then I think the other thing to know is that like AI exposes the weaknesses, right? Because, a human might catch something that AI doesn't. And so now you're going to see the weaknesses in the source text, especially if you're talking about scale. So localizers probably need to collaborate, earlier with writers on resolving like ambiguity, for example.
And is that ambiguity, like, does that kind of go back to the glossaries and those kinds of things? Is that where you see primarily ambiguity, like in nouns, or is it in the overall conceptual content? Like, is there one place that's more?
Yeah, it's more contextual. So if you think about someone who's writing technical documentation, like they're living and breathing and eating it, they know the product really well. The AI doesn't know the product. The AI is literally like looking at segments and trying to figure out like what's going to come next in a different language. And so having context and making sure that you're super clear and making kind of sensible word choices that are going to be understandable to AI and machine translatable, that's important.
Got it. Is there like any very basic advice in, what word choices, those types of things would be better for AI? Like, I'm genuinely curious.
Yeah, like plain English, if you're writing in English. So it's funny because as a user, I think about some of the like help documentation or help text that I've seen, and occasionally like it has a personality, right? And that's part of the brand. That's not something that AI is good at yet. And so if there's like humor and some sort of like a tone, a dry tone or a witty tone or whatever, those kinds of things don't get translated well. And so, for now at least, plain English. Imagine speaking to a non-native English speaker so that, or like, yeah, somebody with high fluency but non-native. You want to make it plain and understandable.
Yeah, Allison, I was going to say there's also those little differences in nuance about how we say things that can be confused when we think we're translating verbatim. For example, the word we say take a photograph. I was involved in a translation project where this word take was in there a lot associated with photographs, but the machine wanted it to be make, because you make a photograph. When you take it, the question is, where are you taking it to? Where did you bring it from? Right? Which is like, we say those things and AI starts to learn about it. But then when we ask it to do verbatim translation, so we can have lots of challenges there. So could you tell our audience, this is a surprise question for you, although I know you know this. This seems like an opportunity for transcreation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It
So
could
tell our
be.
audience what transcreation is compared to like straight translation.
Sure. Transcreation is typically done like by humans, and it's often done with marketing language or language that's highly culturally specific. And so you can imagine like a campaign. Let's just imagine Nike making a campaign, and it's going to be all over the Northeast US. They might be billboards, they might have taglines, blah, blah, photographs, imagery. Now, if you take that same campaign and you put it in Bangladesh, like, and you do a verbatim translation, there's probably going to be stuff that A is lost in translation, B might be culturally offensive, or at a minimum wouldn't be, culturally resonant. So transcreation is when you take the content and you understand the intent and the purpose, and you recreate it for a very specific locale.
I have an example of where it can go awry. So there was a company I was working with, Peoria, Illinois, whose corporate office wanted to make sure that they had a uniform branding messaging, right? Like the same color, the same logo, the same words. Okay, that's where the words came in. And then they decided they were going to sell some products in France. And so it was for an eyewear company, and they wanted to have a slogan underneath their logo on the window and in their stores in Paris. And as it turns out, that when you just straight translate the words from English to French, it turns out to be remarkably similar to a political slogan of one party running for election in France. And much like the United States, it was like a 51-49% split, which meant if they used the words verbatim exactly the way Peoria, Illinois would like them to, they would probably alienate half of the French people who would think that somehow they're aligned with the political candidate. So the argument had to be explained to people, and they had never thought about that because they thought translation just equals word for word. Hey, that's it. But transcreation, right, is where we do more adaptation, right? It's like a creative process. It's not about the machine. It's about rewriting, restructuring, reimagining the message, right? And changing metaphors or humor or idioms that you might have slipped in there that work in your native language for your intent, but don't work elsewhere. Is that
That's great. That's a great description. Even colors.
Oh, wow.
Can be problematic in other cultures.
Really?
Yeah.
Is that like an alignment? Is it like a political alignment thing too? Or like your brand colors might be the
sometimes.
colors of...
Like consider, for example, in Chinese culture that red is a color associated with, prosperity.
Right.
There's other examples. I wish I could think of one right now where, like, for example, yellow is associated with something quite negative, and you wouldn't want to use that. But yeah, Scott, you hit the nail on the head in describing it. And this is why I think having somebody this is why humans, and I hope we're going to talk about humans later, but are important, because an in-country native speaker knows that. And they would probably never bless a marketing campaign or window design to go live.
And that's exactly what happened. Somebody who was local was like, oh, wait a minute. I know I'm on the Zoom call to like bless your French, translation, but your translation was fine. But your messaging will not be received the way you believe it will be, because you don't understand the nuance of what you're saying, because you only cared about the word matches, not about whether it will produce the result that you actually want at the end. And so the long story short was they had to have derivative content. They had to have, content tag for France, basically.
I think that the other thing that's interesting as it relates to AI with this is you'll see a lot of people say that large language models, that's kind of a misnomer. They're actually large English models. And they're even large English models that have a certain viewpoint, just because of the quantity of information they've taken in, skews in that direction, skews towards English, skews towards different viewpoints. So obviously in the translation process, you're using machine learning that's not necessarily one of the public models. So maybe this applies a little bit less, but I think it is worth understanding that there can be bias even inside of the machines that we use to get the words out and make these translations. So like there's all these different points along the production process that can introduce, bias that needs to be checked by humans.
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why technical communicators are probably so valuable too, right? We've heard these stories and these myths. We've seen where content has went awry, and maybe those lessons are not encapsulated in the large language model. That might be a large English model. That's probably one of the scary things about releasing content into the wild without humans reviewing it, right? We wouldn't want that window design to be printed on all the windows, and then we discover the problem.
So in the context of problems, like what types of content problems become more obvious once you start translating?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's start right there. Cultural references or cultural assumption, like Scott said, idioms or like turns of phrase that are familiar to English users but wouldn't translate well, metaphors, humor, unclear references, inconsistent terminology, which everybody said. I think that there was only a few people who said terminology, 20% or something. UI constraints, like if you had some sort of like going back to the PDF, schematic drawing or something in German with like ridiculously long words. So any kind of UI constraints that you didn't anticipate, those are going to be seen once you start translating and localizing. And then I think for technical writers, like I was saying before, when you're living and eating and breathing this content and this product and whatever, like assuming shared knowledge, it can also, when you get the translation, it's not going to have the context it needs.
As more and more organizations start to adopt AI-driven workflows, it seems like we need to identify which human-centered skills become the most important ones that we need to protect. And clearly the example of the universal messaging is one of those challenges where humans can play. What do you think about where the people play a role?
I think that there's growing consensus that it's like judgment, right? Human judgment. And that can come in lots of different forms. So evaluation, like we were talking about with our examples, some kind of in-country native speaker who's looking for bias, looking for accuracy, looking for problematic references. I think judgment in like managing these workflows are becoming more complex than they used to be. So having that kind of human overseer, like even as we get into agentic AI, imagine agentic AI as like a junior colleague who, they get better with some time and some training, but they don't have the judgment and the level of experience that a senior person would. So I think that level of kind of judgment about how things are working and how the orchestration goes, having the big picture context, which the AIs lack. Like I was telling Scott this the other day, but like my husband's a software developer. He uses Claude on the regular. But what he's figured out is that Claude just lacks the context that for him is up here. So everything has to be kind of spelled out and made obvious. So I think the human sort of synthesis maybe would be a good word. Another thing that a human needs to decide for now is like when you have to make trade-offs. Like let's say you have to make trade-offs in like accuracy or turnaround time or cost. The machine doesn't make those decisions yet. Like Scott was saying earlier, brand consistency, that's not super strong yet with AI. And then of course, like emotions and nuance, like the human still needs to be involved in that, or even something like humor.
But it feels like it's judgment and feeling in a lot of ways, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, AIs can fake feelings, right? Like we've all read about this, but certainly when it comes to feelings being expressed like on screen or on the page, humans are still way ahead.
Yeah, and I think that like thinking about it through that lens for me is it's an interesting way of about it, because nobody would trust an AI to like, does this feel right in French? Right? Like nobody would think that was a rational question. So I like that idea of kind of applying those types of filters to it. Like, is this something which is going to have an emotional impact on people? We should have people test that. We should have people, using their human judgment there.
Ooh, actually, I really like that suggestion. I think that's important, right? Because the approach of designing your content is to perform some kind of function, right? We want to convert somebody, educate them, influence them, whatever it is. In order to do so, you often have to use psychology in the word choices that you make because you're trying to evoke emotion from them. And so we want to make sure that the correct emotion is invoked by the words that the system chooses. So I think that is a really good place for human in the loop.
I think like an overarching theme too is trustworthiness.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
You know,
for sure.
Right. That's important.
Yeah, I mean, if you can't trust it, then what's the point, right? You're going to be calling support, which oftentimes is the reason that we produce technical documentation to support people. And we don't want them to have to call. We want them to give them self-service options to make it easy for them because emotionally they will be less likely to have friction, right? And be at our brand. So we want to have a good positive outcome with that. One of our viewers has a question that I thought was relevant. I'm going to just slide in here. She wants to know, how do we easily communicate that technical communicators can find discrepancies in meaning when working with large organizations that have multiple layers of rules, for lack of a better word, this person says? What advice would you say?
Will you say the first part of the question again, Scott?
Yeah. How do we easily communicate that tech writers can find discrepancies in meaning when working with a large organization that has multiple layers of rules? So I think they're having trouble navigating up and explaining why their role matters.
Explaining why their role matters. I mean, wow. Like, let's start with, okay, one of my favorite German words is Schadenfreude, which is essentially like celebrating when some demise happens to a person. And I kind of have that when you see executives making bad decisions that you know are bad decisions. And I think in the case of this listener is saying, look, I know that there's some discrepancy. I have identified it. They should be fixing this, but I'm kind of trapped within these rules. It's almost like you just wait for something to go wrong and say, I told you so. The whole like managing up question, I can't really speak to that from a technical writer's point of view. I can say that from a localizer's point of view, it's hard. It's hard to kind of manage up and to get buy-in from people that are making decisions that impact you when they don't have all the information. They're kind of clueless. And I have these crazy stories from some of our members who, like in one case, a guy would time he didn't even need a bathroom break or coffee, but he would wait until it was his skip level. Like some VP was walking down the hallway and he would go and like, oh, hey, I bumped into you and let me talk to you about this thing. This was how they had to go about sponsorship. So, and support. And so I know, I'm sorry, I'm probably not quite answering your question vis-a-vis technical writing, but I think there's a lot of folks experiencing this everywhere. And maybe we could talk, you guys, about like the kind of the decisions that are being made erroneously. Like, well, maybe we can talk about that later, but you tell me.
Go ahead. Give us an example.
Well, it's like, what leaders prioritize and what they deprioritize or marginalize. I feel like localization is constantly a marginalized task, if you will. Really, like, if you could link technical writing in the same way that we link localization, bad localization to revenue failures or increase in support tickets, or I don't know, whatever metric kind of matters in your world with the executives. Like we always like to say, localization it's the cheapest growth lever that most companies just ignore. And then especially with AI now, there's a lot of folks that think that they have it solved. Like, oh, okay, well, we'll just, throw it into an AI. Why do we need people and process and governance and all the things? Well,
yeah, all that stuff. We could just get rid of that stuff now. Well, we had an AI CEO on a show recently who said something like this: most AI failures come from weak content operations and a lack of understanding, not from bad AI models. And they also argued that in 5 years, those same leaders will realize that AI is not a feature that they bolt on. It's going to be the primary way that users encounter their content. And so if they want to be encountered in the way that's meaningful for their organization, they will have an aha moment that maybe they have been overlooking the importance of content for a while. And it may be painful in the realization, right? It might be a lawsuit or some kind of other trigger that gets their attention. And of course, everybody wants to avoid that.
Yeah, I would agree with most of that, except for the fact that, like, yeah, okay, sure, content and like data matters a lot. Like, let's be clear, it matters a lot. But the models are not perfect, and to assume that the problem is only with the content is fallacy. Like, the models have a ton of bias still, like Patrick was saying. And then when you start to work in translation and you've got a large language model for maybe a smaller language, there's not nearly as much training data. There's more room for error. Like, sorry, we're not quite there yet. Maybe in a few years, but doesn't mean don't pay attention, obviously, to the.
I think the point was too that sometimes the content is not delivered to the training of the LLM in a way that would make the answers be more accurate. And so therefore it's partially our fault that they're wrong, right? Because we're not feeding it the information and the data that it needs.
Yeah. I mean, I can agree with that.
Patrick, I
think the other piece is too is like one of the fallacies I see very often with this stuff is that the AI systems, when they're used as a part of a chain or they're used part of an interface, they go from nothing to prototype and like very interesting prototype, compelling, very, very quickly. And from an executive's perspective, they get the presentation with the prototype and like it looks pretty good. And if you're applying like a traditional software or systems lens to that, like executives are very, very accustomed to seeing something that is 80% and being like, yes, let's finish investing in that. Or, okay, it's a prototype, but like, let's actually put money towards it to get it to production. And historically, it's a matter of engineering, right? Like you fix the bugs, you build up the other use cases, you test it, like all that kind of stuff. And it's all logical. So like it comes out and you maintain it, right? But that's not how AI works. So going that last 50, 25%, it may physically be impossible. So I think that a lot of organizations get to this point where they have something which is really compelling, and then they realize they can't close that final gap. I see that so frequently in conversations, especially when it comes to systems that aren't built on really good data and really good process under the hood. I think that's kind of like where all that stuff, like those comments and those viewpoints come from.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say, like you said, they think they can just finish investing in it. And like, you don't finish investing in an AI model. It has to be maintained and continuously trained and, go from there.
For sure. Well, we're talking about all these challenges. Like, what about like success? Like, what does success look like here? Do you have examples of teams that have done a really good job of blending content operations, localization, in a way that's like had big, great outcomes?
Yeah, there's actually one member of Gala. It's Rotary International, whom some of you may be familiar with that organization. And several years ago, they made like a strategic decision to combine their content teams with their localization and translation teams. And they started generating, this was kind of before generative AI was a big deal. And they had native speakers creating the content. I think what was good for them, and they've done some case studies and kind of dissected it for us a little bit, but they aligned content strategy across all the locales, like in the beginning, and I forget how many locales they have. It's a lot. They always designed for like a global first experience. I think that they had like agreed upon KPIs. So even if you were like a content person or you were more focused on localization functions, everybody was sharing the same KPIs and checking on those. They kind of developed the systems together and the automations together. And I think in their case, it's a success story of, like we were talking about, shifting left, like shifting localization from that last thing that happens before it ships to something that happens much earlier in the process. And Rotary has done a good job. And now I'm seeing more folks, like one of our members is Coupa. It's a financial software company, and they just rebranded their localization team as Global UX, and they're kind of trying to get a more cross-disciplinary approach.
I applaud that, since that was the subject of my talk at Localization World, was why we should do that. And so, is it working for them? Did you have?
Yeah, it's pretty new. It happened early this year, and they've had, like a lot of other companies, they've had a lot of rifts and some churn. And so, like, TBD, we'll see what happens next year.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I think that actually applies to the earlier question you're answering too, is like, how do you get better visibility in the organization? I think one of the things technical writers can do is rebrand. I think technical writing doesn't fully cover the scope of what the job does, because like people do a lot of like quality assurance. They're a line of defense in terms of testing. They have, they're maintaining brand, like they're doing all these types of things. And, maybe realigning what you're calling a technical writing is like the same way that Coupa is doing with localization is a great idea.
I like that whole idea. One of our had a question I think might be something that you could help with, Allison. And that person said, hold on one second. I want to get to this point. Oh, sorry. My screen just refreshed in a funky way. Let me fix that real quick. Okay. Sorry. How would somebody confirm the accuracy of a translation? This is coming from a communication person. There seems to be very little engineering review of documentation. So what's your advice? How would a writer start to confirm the accuracy of a translation, or can you?
Well, the writer probably can't unless they're a native speaker of the language it's been translated into. That's supposed to be part of the process, which is quality evaluation. That is, AI is getting better at doing quality evaluation, but it's still not on par with proper human review. If you work with a translation agency or a company that you outsource, localization to, that really needs to be part of their process. They're the ones that are supposed to be guaranteeing quality, but like there's also these service level agreements that specify certain levels of quality, or like, it's like the guy at the beer factory checking, every third keg of beer. I don't know. They may not be checking everything. It's like spot checking.
What do you think that leaders should prioritize today if they want to build this content ecosystem that's powered by AI that actually supports global users, let's say 5 years or so from now?
Okay, 5 years is a really long time right now to talk about, I would say anything. Anything. Okay, first, I would say having a global first content strategy, right? Like, globalization's not dead in spite of what we're seeing politically. You can't have that, we'll just translate it later. I mean, think about software development, even go back to the beginning of product development. If you're not thinking about being a global first or a global company and your software developers are hard coding strings or something, that's stupid. I think global usability it's just got to be baked in, right? And the name of our conference is World Ready. The concept is your products, your people, everything should be world ready. You should treat content as infrastructure, not just as like a project or some silo over there. I think your content is part of your product. Humans, like obviously TBD, but we know what humans are good at right now. We know what people are promising that AI is going to do in 5 years, but I think having humans who can really add value, and that might change. It will change in the next few years. One of the things you asked, one of the parts of your poll about structure for machine readiness, yes, that they need to invest in data governance. They need to invest in data management. They need to build terminology. Don't wait for, like we were talking about, don't wait for like AI to show you all the inconsistencies that you have, that you should have sorted out earlier. What else? Ethics. Like we talk a lot about the ethics in AI. And I think, there's plenty of folks out there going for quick wins. And we being localizers and people who are going for cultural nuance and cultural resonance and data privacy and things that are important, we don't like the quick wins. We want ethical AI. There's this notion of continuous localization that it just means like as it's just going to happen continuously. I think they need to plan for that. Oh, what we were talking about at the beginning about like cross-functional literacy, were we talking about that or was that my other meeting? Anyway. Being conversant in how your part of the project or your part of the product lifecycle relates to all of the others. I think, encouraging cross-functional and cross kind of disciplinary knowledge would be also a smart investment for leaders to kind of insist on. I think that's it.
Those are all great ideas.
Yeah, that was quite a list of amazing things you could implement that would have a huge impact at your organization. I think if you pick two, you'd probably be pretty far ahead if you get it as an organization.
Yes, it's true. But there's loads. I mean, I'm encouraged that like in your poll, a lot of people feel like, look, terminology and earlier collaboration isn't really a big deal. They're doing it already. Cool.
Yeah, I think that when you have a company that has yet to scale, these things probably start to show themselves in uncomfortable ways. I remember we had another guest talk to us about the need to standardize processes so the system could scale. And then people were like, wait a minute, if you want me to standardize so I can personalize, doesn't that not make any sense? But we know that the machines need standards in order to perform in the way that we would like them to. We cannot relinquish our responsibility because they don't have the information that they need to do the right job for us. So they said that the leader said that we needed to introduce component content management systems. We needed to use automation for low value, high frequency work. I think something about repeatable content operations processes across teams that collaborate. So if the tech comm people and the localization people could do that, there have to be opportunities for alignment and improvement. So maybe that's part of our messaging as well.
Yeah, I like what you said. We have a theme here that's like automate the grind. Just automate the grind, please.
Yes, please do that.
There.
All right, Patrick, do you want to take another question?
Yeah, so I think this is actually keying into one of the things you mentioned in your list. Like, how do you see the role of multilingual content shifting when we're moving more towards continuous AI translation or instant translation or something, in that spectrum?
Well, instant is definitely not accurate. What part of that, like there's kind of a lot in that, Patrick. What part of that do you want me to focus on?
So I think it's really, how does multilingual content work as we get more of these automations in, as the AI increases in its overall capability? So How do we start to fold those things into our processes so that we have a good mixture of efficiency, automation, and also quality?
Yeah. Okay. So for me, like I kind of bristle at some of these ideas because it's been part of the hype cycle. I would say this, AI can produce translations instantly. It's fine. We don't need people. We don't need these same processes. So I bristle a little bit at that. But okay, so how would you think about that then? Well, don't jettison your localization team. Don't jettison your, documentation team because they're still pretty critical. So I think we want to see a scenario where like localization becomes central to quality, to the quality of the product, to trust. Like we talked about trustworthiness earlier, and like I said, instant doesn't mean accurate. Okay. And the humans are still going to be super relevant, like we talked about earlier, with judgment, with quality evaluation, with orchestration. But I do think that what's cool is that it's allowing so much more content to be translated and localized. Okay. So the speed, like there was just a presentation by a company in our world called Smartling. They presented some data. They could do something like 60% more translation, like content, in the same amount of time, that it took them, I don't know, a year ago. I don't remember the stats, but it was pretty staggering. So that part's cool. And I think that it means that, yes, please keep producing the content, because now we can get it out to more locales, more languages, more people, more language access. So I think maybe if I were going to end on a happy note, it would be that like maybe more people are going to get more access to more content in their own language and in their own culture with this notion of like, instant translations.
In fact, that instant translation thing, I think the first time I ever heard it was Vandermeer, the CEO of Taos, and for the viewers, that's the Translation Automation User Society, I think, and you could find them at Taos, TAUS.net, TAUS.net. They have a lot of resources there about translation and automation, in case you're wondering, that organization. But he said he thought that it would be ubiquitous. and then it would be attached to all the products that we have. And he was very much a proponent of that. And at the time, it seemed very fanciful, right? That theoretically we could do it, but now it seems like that might be something that might be possible. Do you think that that's the case, that your industry that you represent is going to be more important and impactful and attached to all kinds of products and services that we never imagined until we had AI?
Yeah, I mean, well, I hope so. I think that what the AI revolution has done for language and localization is like put it kind of in the public sphere. So nobody used to know what an LLM was, but like our people have been using them. They didn't call it that necessarily, but they've been using them to train machine translation engines for years. And so I think that like language has had a little bit of a zeitgeist, and like, you know, think about the announcement recently. I forget whether it was Apple or Google, but like the translation earbuds, right? Where you and I, Scott, could have a conversation. I might be speaking Spanish, but you would hear it through your, you know, I'm sure everybody heard about that. But like, yeah, you know, it's becoming more ubiquitous. I don't think it's necessarily going to become universal, especially because we've got like thousands of languages and dialects. Okay. Not everybody has equal access yet. And that's going to take a really long time.
That's a good point.
Yeah, that makes sense. Should we grab some from the audience?
Yeah, let's do
towards the
that.
end of our time. All right. Let's see here. So I'm just going to read this. I haven't read this one yet. Sometimes it seems to help to have a different AI validate the output of the AI that created it. Sometimes even a different chat in the same AI. This method always catches something, especially when AI research seems to use a sandbox. Question, what is your experience?
Yeah. Now, again, like what I'll say is I'm not a practitioner, right? I'm running an association, but yes, it's kind of like having when you were in elementary school and you would self-check your own like spelling or math test. How many of us, let's be honest, like didn't mark something when we got it wrong?
I always got a B+.
Confession time. But yeah, it is wise, right? Because it's you know, it's like we were saying earlier, there is potentially a bias. It's trained on a particular set of data. Maybe it's trained in a vertical that's or like domain expertise that's not the same as this other one. And so yeah, it's basically like having somebody else, another set of eyes. And so yes, I think that's a best practice. I don't know all that much about some of the automated quality checks. People are definitely building tools to do that. And I would imagine that they're not going to use the same, you know, LLM to kind of do the proofreading, let's say.
Here's a question for you then. What emerging skill do you think will matter the most for professionals who are trying to navigate both AI and global content in the next few years?
Judgment. Let's go back to judgment, you know, like critical thinking. It's like all the things that we want students to learn in university, but they don't necessarily. Determining the trustworthiness, because when it comes down to it, like people make choices and brand choices about trustworthiness. Let's see, being a culture expert, like knowing not just the language, but understanding the culture. Even if you're a technical writer, not a localizer or a translator or a linguist or whatever, I think having that kind of expertise is an asset for sure. You know, this is a big question that Gala's grappling with right now, because there's this notion that people need to upskill and reskill, but we're not entirely certain, if I'm honest, what the roles are morphing into. And so it's hard to say, oh, you have to take this class. You have to reskill in whatever. But like an example could be, you know, search engine optimization. Somebody might have been an expert in that, but now they need to tweak a little bit to be answer engine optimizers, which is different. But, you know, the things that I think if you're going to be working with AI and global content, you know, understand that the machine's going to do the drudgery. It's going to automate the grind, and you have to figure out the high value things that humans are still required for in the process and become very good at those things. And I also personally think having that cross-disciplinary kind of like high altitude picture of the whole orchestration is also super useful.
Patrick, can I grab another question from the audience?
I want just commenting on that very quickly.
Oh.
I think understanding the systems and understanding the components of the systems always has value. Like regardless of wherever these systems go, whatever their capabilities are, like AI is just another form of automation. And the more you understand, any piece of technology, and the more you're able to implement it and view it in a systems perspective, you're always going to have value in the marketplace. So
I think that our pattern in the past might have been to learn a specific tool because we were trying to get placed in a job that would use that tool. But now we're being asked to be creative and understand the foundational way that those tools work and how we can insert ourselves into that process, right? Where we're actually using the machine to small pieces work together, which is that orchestration part that you keep talking about, I think, Allison.
Yeah, orchestration, and I think Patrick's talking about like architecture literacy, let's say. I think one more thing that I would say we haven't really talked that much about is risk awareness, especially if you're working in a regulated industry, where there's high degrees of risk. I think the human who really understands like risk analysis and risk mitigation could be useful too.
Excellent.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. We got a couple more. Let's see if we can sneak a few in. All right. So we've got, I'm not sure, is this an acronym that I'm supposed to know? But like IIUC. Okay. Shifting. I don't know that one. So IIUC, localization work closer to the content creation is the recommendation. What about UX localization? In my experience, there are changes up to the release freeze. Where I used to work, UX localization happened very close to the end, since it's both hairy and costly if there are too many iterations.
That's true. That's true. That's a pretty specific type of localization for sure. If they're like doing the GUI or any kind of like user interface, like specifically, if we narrow in on UI instead of UX, like you're right, that is costly if developers are making changes. So yes, I think that we can have both of those things exist in harmony. You've got maybe kind of the shifting left of some of the, well, then again, if you're doing the technical writing now, you're taking screenshots at the very end. And that's a tough one. I think those are bad habits, right? That there's these changes happening until the very end. But I really don't know what to say other than like, yeah, you're right.
We've got a final question here from a viewer. Is there any possibility that you can write English content using very simple words so that it can be translated directly and accurately without having to consider cultural context? Leading to yes, is that possible?
It's going to be boring. It's going to be yeah. So I mean, yes, you can, and if that is okay with your brand, then that's cool. Then you can do that. But I think that a lot of brands don't want that. And now there's this like most people can recognize generative AI like writing these days. And I think it's going to be that way where when a human reads something and it sounds really kind of flat and boring and super plain English, I mean, it depends on the context, okay? It might be fit for purpose, whatever you're doing. And that to me is really matters. Is it fit for purpose? If so, cool. Is it a review on Amazon? Who cares? Is it how the technician is going to repair the machine that does radiation on somebody's breast cancer? Like, really matters, right? So it's got to be fit for purpose, and plain English and like boring translations could be totally fine.
Awesome. Patrick, do you want to ask the question that we ask everybody at the end of the show?
I do. Awesome. All right, Allison, what, in your opinion, is the most exciting thing happening in the world of information management today?
Okay, I love this question because like I got a master's in library and information science like 20 years ago, okay, a long time ago. And I would say that the most exciting thing is that it's moved from being like dorky and on the margins to being something that's really mission critical for most companies. So like moving kind of to the center and being part of the infrastructure for businesses. I think that's really cool. I think what's happening with retrieval is super cool because, oh my gosh, I had this one hideous job where I was helping train the Bing algorithm. You can kind of imagine what that looked like when I was in grad school. So like retrieval is amazing nowadays. And they're making like answer engines are trying to be like make sense engines, which I think is really cool. The last thing I'll say about that is something I've already said, that like language has become a part of information management, where I think for a very long time it was an afterthought. It's now being considered more seriously. So I'm also excited about that.
Gosh, I love that. We're cool now. That's like the best answer we've gotten in a long time. I've always wanted to actually be cool.
It took a long time, but here we are, cool, and didn't know it.
Awesome.
Allison, thank you so much. That was great.
That was
Thank
fun.
you,
Thanks,
Allison.
guys. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right. On your way out today, could you please rate and provide us feedback? 5 stars being an amazing show and all feedback being read, considered, and appreciated.
Awesome. Yes, please do that. And you can scroll down beneath your webinar viewing panel to do that. There's a little vote tab where it'll allow you to share your opinion and any commentary that you might have. Also, thanks to Heredo for being our sponsor. You can learn more about them on the web at heredo.com. I advise you check out their website. There's some great content there. And thanks again for being the sponsor of our show. We really appreciate it. You've been watching Coffee and Content with Patrick Bosek and Scott Abel. We were interviewing Allison Furch from Gala about content and context, AI's impact on technical writing and localization. Thanks for joining us. As always, be well, be safe, and keep doing great work. We will see you on another episode of Coffee and Content in the near future. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Allison.
Thanks, guys.